everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Flyleaf Books to hear Barbara Sullivan talk about her new book, Climate Change Gardening for the South, with Elaine Maisner. Barbara Sullivan, author of Garden Perennials for the Coastal South, lives and gardens in Wilmington, North Carolina. UNC Press Executive Editor Elaine Maisner retired in April 2022 after 35 years in publishing, including the past 28 years at UNC Press, where she established award-winning lists in the areas of religious studies, Latin American and Caribbean studies, and food studies. I hope you enjoy, and thank you so much for supporting your local indie.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So glad to see all of you. Barbara, I've known for so long, but I think this is the first time we've actually met, in person that is. And when I talked to her a little bit more about her background, I was really surprised and super impressed because I don't know how many of you know that Barbara not only is an author and master gardener from, let's see, you got your Master Gardener degree from NC State Cooperative Extension Service and have gone on to do a lot of garden-related media on PBS television, writing, editing, commentator on radio, and author of 2 books of ours. Barbara had approached UNC Press, which has a long history of gardening books. And her first book was Garden Perennials for the Coastal South, published in '03. And, you know, as with everything, trends change and needs change. And this book is particularly of use to people who have gardened a lot and need to get with the program in terms of climate change. And also, when I asked our staff at UNC Press about book topics that they were interested in terms of gardening, a lot of them talked about climate change. And so I knew to call Barbara because she knows everything. She was, did you know she's an attorney, went to George Washington University Law School, and she worked as a foreign service officer in Morocco, civil rights attorney, and many other things. So, Barbara, we're going to start today. She's going to do a PowerPoint. But first, we're going to chat a little bit, and then we'll have questions and answers after the PowerPoint. I have 3 questions that I've devised to ask Barbara, and I'm just going to ask them straight off the bat. All of them relate to the kinds of issues that really underlie this book, really big, important issues, couldn't be bigger. But the questions are very specific. So the first one is kind of an easy one, I think, and it includes the answer. What occupies, Barbara, more than 40 million acres, that's 63,000 square miles, in the continental US, and, second part, are cultivated grass lawns in league with the devil?
Yes, well, turf grass lawns do occupy about 40 million acres in the United States, including private lawns and houses, golf courses, playing fields, schools, things like that. And the reason, just a little background, back in the late 1700s, there was a landscape architect named Capability Brown, who was very famous and was the darling of very, very wealthy people who had enormous estates. And one of the things he did was to create natural-looking landscapes, and he had these huge swaths of turf grass that were mown lawns. And so that became a status symbol to show that you had enough land that you didn't need to grow crops on it. You could just have it lie there and be a lawn to look at, and that became very popular. And what happened after that is that the not just the wealthy people, but the middle class also adopted it. And from there, it just came to the United States, and it's been popular ever since. And I think possibly there's a trend now away from lawns because they're not naturally healthy. They're monocultures, so they don't have biodiversity. They don't support pollinators, and because they're monocultures, they're not very naturally resistant to diseases and insects. So people put a lot of chemicals into their lawns, and the chemicals can leach out and get into the groundwater and end up polluting our rivers and streams. They kill soil organisms, and there are just many reasons that lawns are. People are relooking. They're rethinking about whether they really need.
Are any of you rethinking your lawns? If you have one?
We have so little.
Yeah. Small lawn, like the little one, just let grow and mow it. Fine, but just yesterday, I got this large company's flyer all about lawns, and there's so much vested interest in lawns in this country. Yeah, like lawn rejuvenation, use fertilizer.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Okay, well, question number 2. Which vegetable needs a minimum of 6 hours full sun in order to produce well?
So all the hot weather vegetables really like to have 6 hours. So that would be tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, okra, things like that. Some of the cool weather vegetables like lettuces and chard and spinach and root vegetables can do with a little bit of shade. They don't need the full 6 hours necessarily. They might grow slower, but they will still produce.
And have you found in your work as a gardener and as a speaker that a lot of interest in growing food, has that increased over time, or what would you say?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I think sometimes there are people who just grow food. Like I have friends who just grow food, and they may have a few flowers in between. And then there seem to be people who, like myself, maybe I've tried growing some food, but who prefer non-food gardening. So
Yeah, kind of like you're either a baker or a cook. There's always this
division.
division.
Right. Yeah.
But we did want a full chapter on growing food. It's chapter 10 in this book, and I know that a lot of younger people actually want to save money by growing food and be more in control of the food they eat. So that's something to remember here. In fact, it's a good book as a gift for younger people if you're giving gifts this year. And I also saw just this morning on food, this New York Times article about climate smart agriculture. I don't know if you saw this, I can give it to you, but it's about on a larger scale how climate smart agriculture is a niche but a growing trend. And there's all kinds of environment and climate, change friendly processes that farmers are using. So this is big. This is big business, can go both ways.
Right.
We'll see what happens, right?
I think is when I was driving here, I was remembering there are movies that you all may be familiar with back in the 50s that were black and white, and you'd have the patient, which was usually some young man who was in the doctor's office, and after the examination was over, they would sit and talk to one another, and the doctor would light the patient's cigarette, and they both sit and have a chat about the health. This was like normal, and I thought this is how things change. Or I'm trying to think what another example I had. Anyway, they're just examples of how people's minds have completely changed, and I think we may be at the beginning of this change in terms of gardening. Some people, of course, have been way ahead of us for years, knowing a lot of what's important for the environment. But in the mainstream gardening, in the garden industry, I think I'm hoping there's going to be a shift. I think there will be a shift. We'll see.
There's so many issues, not only vested interests, industrial interests in manufacturing, but that people, don't know. So my next question is kind of like that, about that. So I'm very fond of sitting around, and I don't have, if I were very fond of sitting around, let me put it that way, and if I really didn't have much money to spare, how could I be a gardener? It seems like it takes so much money.
Well, the first person that I interviewed when I started researching for the book was a man in Wilmington, North Carolina named Andy Wood, and he said, and he's been promoting the idea of low maintenance gardening for years now. And so I said, what does that mean exactly? And he's basically stopped doing a lot of the things that you were doing. So first of all, stop buying all these chemicals, so that saves you money. Stop fertilizing, stop using pesticides and herbicides and fungicides, etc. And basically, as I researched this book, I started to reframe how I looked at gardens. And so instead of feeling like, speaking for myself now, instead of feeling like I have to rake up every single leaf and I have to take up all the leaves of the plants that don't look right, etc., and have some image of some kind of a garden that I'm trying to create. When you start to look at it more from the point of view of the natural ecosystem, you can let more things go. It doesn't have to become a complete mess and a disaster, but there's a lot you can stop doing that you thought was so important. And also, so you'll save money, you'll save effort, and a lot of things can be grown from seed, and you can let the garden plant itself in certain ways. Like you can let certain plants jump over to, seed themselves over to another part of your garden, or have shrubs that have, they're called colonizing, so they send out stolons or rhizomes, and they make babies of themselves. So you end up with a whole thicket of oak leaf hydrangeas or something like that. It's just a different concept of gardening.
So you need to kind of shift your frame a little bit.
Exactly.
Have you found that it's helpful to have a group of people who are in it together, who help each other, who talk about techniques? Because I can imagine people who are just starting to garden, they're going to read the book and learn so much, but it also could be helpful if they could talk to other people. Is that?
Right. Well, I think that would be good. I know that one of the chapters near the end, I talk about community gardens and getting together. And, even people who may not have their own garden plot, or not have a space where they can garden. In many, many parts of the South, in the cities and towns, there are community gardens where you can just have a portion of the garden and someone else will have another portion. And certainly if you were participating in that, you can get lots of tips.
Oh, that's a great idea.
There's a chapter on different things that you can do to connect with other people who have the same ideas that you do about.
Wow, that's great. Yeah.
So,
all right.
should we answer your questions?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to
very
do
well.
my PowerPoint. And
Yeah. Do you want to sit?
I'm going to just stand over there.
Oh, okay.
All right. Okay, so. Is everybody that's here today somebody who gardens or likes to garden? Okay, good. So when Elaine asked me to write this book, I was coming from the point of view of traditional gardening, and I've been a gardener for many decades. I won't even tell you how many. And I had read books about climate change, which were very discouraging. I mean, I think if you've ever read even one book about climate change, it's kind of sobering. But I had never really thought of the connection between the two, and I just loved doing the research and learning things. And so after I got over the initial discouragement of reading through all the facts about climate change, which will just about do you in, I ended up getting actually sort of happy and hopeful, because it was like, well, gardeners they have something they can do. Not everybody has, I mean, we all have something we can do, but gardeners have an additional something they can do, which is to make choices in every way they approach their garden that can actually, first of all, we can adapt to what's going to happen with climate change, but also we can mitigate. We can actually make a difference. So, thank you for asking me to learn about that. Every time we're planting anything, especially trees, of course, but shrubs and perennials and anything else we plant, we are storing carbon. So we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is helping fight climate change. So just by gardening itself, we're helping. I guess what I want to say this evening is that every single choice we make is going to matter. And that's kind of empowering. I don't think I ever thought about that before when I was gardening. So there are 3 ways that we can make a difference. We can make gardens that will build in resistance to climate change extremes. We can help our fellow creatures, and there's some practices we can stop doing that will make a difference also. But in order to do this, you may have to reframe how we look at things, which is what I was talking about earlier. So this is actually a painting that I did at the Ladybug for my grandchild. So I just randomly picked this portrait on the left, which is some Dutch gentleman in the 16th century, I think. But to show the point that, you know, over the millennia, people, for better or worse, have looked at nature as being something that they could use for their own benefit, and they could use as much of it. It was sort of an infinitely disposable resource. They could do whatever they wanted with animals, plants, etc. And we have kind of looked at gardening that way, making gardens do whatever we want them to do. And that's because we've always seen the world that we're the center of it. It's from our perspective, it's what we want. So I'm suggesting that if we put the ladybug in the center of the frame, if we put nature in the center of the frame, it just shifts how you see your garden. So if you think for a second why you garden, everyone here might come up with a different idea. These are some pictures of my garden, and the reasons that I garden have in the past, at least up until now, gardened is to, I like shapes and colors and textures, and I try to make it look nice. And it's kind of a spiritual place for me to go and have a little haven. And I think everyone's different. As Elaine said, some people, they garden for different reasons. In a way, a lot of us want some sort of control of our yard, however, whatever size our yard is. We may just want to get it under control, some people more than others. And certainly some of the more beautiful gardens in Europe are very controlled. And so that's one reason. Another is to possibly experiment. If you're a really avid gardener, you may love experimenting with all different plants and combinations, and I think I sort of fall into that category also. And that's fun and addicting. Or we may want to grow food, as Elaine said. And that's wonderful for many reasons, and it's very rewarding for many reasons. But if we wanted to do all of these things, keep things under control, experiment with new plants, grow food, we might look at how we do that in relationship to the health of the planet. And what I would suggest is that we look at the garden as part of the web of the natural world. And we sort of know this, but speaking for myself, I think I just thought of my garden as just being my garden. It's in the back of my yard, and it's not really related to anybody else's garden or anything else that's going on in the world, or to our national parks out in Wyoming or whatever. It's just my garden. But it's, if we think of all gardens as connected to the web of the entire natural world, then we make different choices. So this is a very simple sort of first grade level chart, but just to show that if you go to any one point on the chart, for example, if you go to the insects, insects of course need plants, but they actually need specific plants. 90% of caterpillars, for example, have to have very specific, they can't just go to any plant and lay their eggs. They can't just go to any plant to eat, like the butterfly or the moth cannot just go to any plant to lay the eggs, and the caterpillar larvae cannot just eat any plant. There are specific plants with which they co-evolve, sometimes over millions of years, and that's the plant that they need to find in order to reproduce and to survive. And 80% of flowering plants need pollinators. So without pollinators, they can't thrive and survive. 75% of our crops need pollinators. And 96% of birds rely on caterpillars to feed their babies. So you can just see that it's all interconnected. And if one part goes, the whole rest of the web is damaged. And I just want to say one more thing that I get really excited about, which is the dirt. And I heard the most amazing story on NPR a couple of days ago. I don't know if anyone heard it, about mycorrhizae. And I'm not a person who ever did well in school in biology or any, that was the only science I ever took. I never took any other science, and I did terribly. But I find it's the most amazing thing. So mycorrhizae, briefly, are just these little fungi that attach to the roots of plants. And plants, if they didn't have mycorrhizae growing on them, a tree would only get as tall as a tulip. So because all the plant roots can do is sort of hang on, but they can't get the water, and they can't get the food, and they can't get the minerals that they need to get straight and tall, and it's just so interesting. So the mycorrhizae are these little things that communicate to the plant roots and say, I want you to soften up a little bit, and I'm going to suck the carbon, the sugars out from you, because I need sugars to eat. And I'm going to give you all these minerals that I have been mining. They've been in the ground. It's just amazing. So in 1 tablespoon of soil, of healthy soil, are billions and billions of living organisms. So the soil is really a very wonderful thing, and the soil is as important as any other element in this whole web. Every element is as important. And once you start sort of getting that, which I think we just don't go around thinking about very much, then it's like, oh, okay, well, I really don't want to poison my soil, because then there'll be a chain reaction. So there's 3 things that we can do. We can build in resilience, we can help our fellow creatures, and we can stop using harmful practices. Let's look at the first one. So how do we build in resilience? First of all, what are we building in resilience to? Climate change consequences. So basically what the predictions are is that we're going to have sea level rise, and we're going to have more frequent and more severe storms, droughts, flooding, heat waves, and then there's going to be an increase in pests and diseases. As I said, it's not the happiest of news. So what can we do about all this? We can build in resilience. So let's start with heat waves and drought. That's something that we've certainly experienced this summer. I assume you all did up here, we did in Wilmington. So to make your garden more resilient to drought and heat waves, first rule would be to plant in the fall. When you plant in the fall as opposed to the spring, then the plants have a much longer period of cool, pleasant weather, usually with plenty of rain, to get their roots established. And actually, another amazing figure that 80% of a plant's energy goes into the roots, into developing its roots. You think it goes into flowering and, growing branches and leaves, but it actually goes into the roots. So if you plant in the fall, it gets to establish a nice, strong root system so that when the heat does come in the summer, it will be better able to tolerate it. You want to keep your soil healthy, which we explained about that. Then also when you choose plants, choose drought-tolerant plants. And in the book, there's some charts that show what plants are drought-tolerant. Trees, shrubs, grasses, perennials, ferns, things like that. And natives, which I'll talk about in a second, are really a great solution because a lot of native plants from the southeast are just naturally much more resilient, much more drought tolerant. Some of them are flood tolerant. They can stand up to our heat because they've evolved over so many millennia to deal with what we have here. A couple of other things for drought is to use hydrozoning, meaning that you assemble the plants that need more water near one another and the plants that need less water near one another, so that so it's easier. You save water and it saves time when you're watering. And a goal that I have heard, and I think I put it in my book, and that somebody mentioned, is that optimally you'd have 60% of what you've planted in your yard that would not need any extra irrigation. So that's something to strive for. I haven't gotten there yet, but so having thought about droughts, we also have to think about hurricanes like Ian. And floods. And so in order to build a garden that's resilient for flooding, there's a few things. First of all, the reason flooding is harmful is because often the good topsoil gets eroded. Polluted matters that are on top of the soil can run into streams and lakes and pollute those and kill the fish. And if there's fertilizer in there, it causes algae blooms. If it's flooding, can also uproot trees, and it can actually drown plants if it stays around, if the water stays around long enough. So again, what we would do is choose flood-tolerant plants. And in the book, I have a list of flood-tolerant plants for the South. If you have plants in your yard that you know that, if you have spots in your yard that you know tend to flood, you can use raised beds, you can create a rain garden, you can create something called a bioswale, which is sort of like a meandering path that will take the water away from where there's more water to where there's less water. And you can do French drains, and I talk about these various things also in the book. But the bottom line is that we want to create in our garden a healthy ecosystem so that will make them more resilient. Because if you have an unhealthy ecosystem in your garden, you will be more prone to damage from droughts and heat waves and floods. And if you have a healthier one, it'll be more resilient. So this is the golden rule, having to do with creating a really healthy garden. Rather than just choosing a plant because you happen to go to a garden center and you see a plant that looks nice. I don't know why this is, but there are garden centers that sell plants that don't do well in the place where they're selling the plants. They shouldn't do that, but they do. There's a lot of them that don't work. And I often have to keep my mouth shut when I'm in some of these places because the person's saying, oh, this will do great, this will do great. I'm just thinking, but I'm very good. I don't go up to strangers and tell them not to buy plants. But in any case, you have to actually pay attention to what you're planting because there are some plants, natives of course will do wonderfully, but there are non-native plants that will also do wonderfully, but you have to pay attention to the USDA zone, and here it's in Chapel Hill it's 7B, and the EPA has come out with these a chart of ecoregions. So if you want to really delve into it, you can go to the EPA website and find which ecoregion you're in, and that will help you know more about what plants will do well. So if you get plants that do well and then you put them in the right place in your garden. So if it's a plant that needs full sun and you put it in the shade, which I have been known to do, hoping that it would not know that it needed full sun, and it's, no, I'm going to die on you because I need full sun. So you have to put the plant where it's needs to be, in the shade, the sun, a dry spot, a moist spot, depending on what. So you can do a little bit of research. So one way to do this is you mimic what occurs in nature. And in nature, one of the movements, I would say, with climate change gardening is to try to create communities. So in this picture, we have some echinacea and some phlox that are growing together, and that's how they grow in nature. If you go to North Carolina mountains and you see the meadows and you see what just grows naturally next to one another that are sort of their buddies in the communities, that's what we're trying. That's a if you were just starting a brand new garden, that would be a great way to start a garden, is just to try to replicate what's occurring in nature, plant those things near one another. Okay. And one more thing I want to add that I also get very excited about, which is kind of like about the dirt, which is so the plants that have grown up together in nature have co-evolved over millions of years, so they actually support one another. And what they're finding out now about trees is amazing, which is that trees have a whole underground communication system with one another, and even trees that are not the same species help each other out. They're like, danger, you know, such and such of a insect is coming down and they will let the trees further on know, and the trees will then produce a really not tasty substance so that the insects will not be attracted. So they will actually warn and help save their fellow trees. I think that's just so interesting. And then when one tree is getting old and dying, this is really amazing, and getting ready to give up the ghost, it will dump its resources, dump its carbon, so that the next generation can use those resources. So that you can't make this stuff up. It's pretty amazing. So we're just trying to, as much as we can, mimic nature within our gardens to at the extent that we can. We can't create a whole national park in our backyard, but we can mimic it. So the one takeaway that I'm hoping will come through this evening is that native plants are fantastic. They've evolved in this environment, as I said. They usually need much less pampering. They don't need fertilizing. They generally are good. They resist pests and diseases much better than the non-natives. They can be drought and flood tolerant. And they, most important, they benefit all of our native pollinators, all the various insects, the birds, the mammals that depend on the insects. So they support wildlife. And when we're choosing native plants, we don't want to just choose a few. We want to choose as many as we can, as we have the time and the money, and that we can make a very, very biodiverse backyard, garden, or whatever space you're gardening in. You want to make it as biodiverse as possible. And biodiversity, if you listen to reports about people who are trying to save species and save wild areas, biodiversity is a hugely important concept. And so it's also important in our garden because you're providing more benefit for a greater number of insects and other animals. And you're also building in redundancy so that if you have, I'm sure you've seen or you've had experience where you build a hedge and then one of the parts of the hedge dies, and so you have a big hole in the hedge. So it's sort of the same concept that if you have all of one kind of plant and for some reason that plant gets a disease or a sickness, you sort of lost your whole garden. But if you have biodiversity, you have all sorts of different things that can survive. So and those are just, I've thrown in a few pictures of native plants just because they're so beautiful, and I just love looking at pictures of plants. Other people do too. Um, yeah, and as I said, I think earlier when we were, when Elaine and I were talking, you can let the garden plant itself, and so, that's another way. So here are just a few more plants that you can, so not just thinking of trees and shrubs, but there's ferns, there's wonderful ornamental grasses that are all, these are all natives. And so you can mix and match and combine them, ground covers, and, so now let's move on to the, our goal of helping our fellow creatures. And I don't even know what those fellow creatures are. I just downloaded that image and I think it's amazing looking. So the good news is everything we've talked about so far, everything I've talked about so far is going to help our fellow creatures. So that's good. And the reason this is important is that, as I said before, there's a huge number of plants that require pollinators, and the insects co-evolved with the native plants over millions of years. And Kew Gardens in England has come out with a study recently saying that they believe that 40% of the world's plants are at risk for extinction. So if the plants go extinct, the wildlife will go extinct. So that's another reason to be using native plants. So what's happening with climate change is that it's leading to early bud break. Bud break meaning when deciduous trees and shrubs first set out their first little leaves in the spring is called bud break. And that's happening earlier. In fact, some people up at Walden Pond decided to make a study of that, and Thoreau had documented what bud break was for a number of plants. So they went back and documented what's happening now, and they found it was about 18 days earlier than it used to be. So that's fine, except for that the birds and the insects have evolved their timing to be there at a certain time of the year, and the times are now mismatched. So moths and butterflies may not have the right place to lay their eggs. Birds may be there at the wrong time to find the caterpillars. It's basically the timing messes up this web that we were talking about. So that is a problem. Also, insects and birds and other mammals are migrating. They're migrating poleward, meaning in the northern hemisphere toward the North Pole and the southern hemisphere toward the South Pole. And sometimes they're migrating up, sort of up to higher elevations, up mountains and things, basically, in all cases to get to cooler weather. And plants, of course, can't migrate as quickly as animals can. They can migrate through seed dispersal and things like that, and they migrate much more slowly. And climate change is leading to invasive plants, which I'll talk about briefly in a second, and invasive pests. And this is the reason that we need to be trying to help, if we can at all, be part of the solution. And I'm just going to read you real briefly from someone named Doug Talamy, who goes around the country speaking about this. This is a book he wrote called Bringing Nature Home. We have taken and modified for our own use between 95 and 97% of all land in the lower 48 states. 53 to 55% has been converted to cities and suburbs. As far as our wildlife are concerned, we have shrunk the continental United States to 1/20th of its original size. This is magnified by the fact that the wild areas are not contiguous, but rather like islands. Unless we modify the places we live, work, and play to meet not only our own needs, but the needs of other species as well, nearly all species of wildlife native to the United States will disappear forever. Because we have already fragmented the continent into habitat islands, we have set the clock ticking for our biodiversity, and time is running out. So that's very sobering. What we can do in our gardens to help wildlife, we can plant food for insects and birds. So that means food for the larvae, the caterpillar, plant fruits and nuts, use plants that have seeds and berries. So during the winter, there'll be seeds and berries. We can stop using toxic chemicals which poison the ground, but also poison some of the organisms that the other animals feed on. We can, as we said, use biodiversity planting in our garden. We can create thickets for shelter and for them to hide in. And one other idea, which I think is wonderful, that some towns and cities are doing, which is that neighbors get together with neighbors and try to create planting corridors so that your garden is maybe contiguous in your neighbor, and this creates corridors for the wildlife, which is what they need as they are looking for food and etc. And the other thing I would say is that we should plant for all 4 seasons, because in this area of the country we can have color all 4 seasons of the year. And that's not hard. It's not hard to find plants and this will give, again, more choice for insects and pollinators. We should consider the winter and make sure that we have provided some sort of food and habitat during the winter. And I just want to mention that time when winter is just about over and spring is coming, but it's not quite there, and you really get the urge to clean up the garden. And this is something I should have known about, but I didn't know about till I started researching this book, which is that we want to wait for 7 days till the temperature has been above 50 degrees for 7 days in a row before we start cleaning up, because there are butterflies, bees, lacewings, and ladybugs that live in the dried stalks of the flowers and in the leaf litter. So I just was unaware of that. That's a really good example of how I was just gardening for what I thought would look nice, and I was sort of pretty much blind to the fact that there was all sorts of stuff happening that I didn't know. So, and then if you put down mulch, again, maybe wait that same period of time, because there are insects that make their nests in the ground during the winter, and so they need to emerge. You don't want to smother them with mulch. So that's hard to do. I did that this year. It's hard to do, but I did it. And the other thing you can do is, which is what I did, is you can, if you want to take up your dried leaf stalks and things like that, if you just can't stand it another second, you can put them over in the corner of your yard, and then the insects can emerge over in the corner. And then if you're all about to explode with all this information, there's my dog.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, that's just a pause. Okay, now the final topic, the final shift, I should say, that we're going to look at is stopping our harmful practices. And what are the practices? Well, we want to stop using toxic chemicals as much as we can, and possible switch from gas-powered equipment. And I must say that actually this morning I finally got up the courage. It's taken me a year and a half, and I finally found the lawn service that we've used for the last 30 years, and he's a very nice man. I said, this isn't personal, but I just we can't use you anymore because of the gas powered. And he said, okay. And he seemed to, I don't know, we didn't have a long discussion, so I don't know. He didn't say, what do you mean? So he may have been aware that gas powered equipment is, again, it's like the movie scene with the doctors and the patients smoking a cigarette together. I mean, at some point, there are some cities in the Northeast that have banned gas-powered So that hasn't happened where we live, but, so that's what I've done. Now we're gonna see what's gonna happen after this. But the alternatives are, well, we'll get to that in a second. I'm gonna talk briefly about invasives and why we absolutely must not plant them and must get rid of them if we have them. And then the lawn we sort of talked about already. So I think I've mentioned this, but just to be clear, I had shelves full of these chemicals. I had shelves full because I felt like I had to kill every kind of bug there was. I had to get rid of all the weeds that there were, etc. But it's actually not true. You actually don't need to, and especially if you plant a lot of natives, they're going to take care of themselves. And also, if you see a lot of chewed leaves, it means you're doing things right. It means that your native insects are getting some food and also. What happens is you're trying to kill one thing, but you end up killing beneficial insects like ladybugs and all sorts of insects that would otherwise be helping you kill the bad insects. You say killing them as well. It leaches, these will leach into the groundwater. They'll end up in the streams, the rivers, the lakes. And if there are systemic chemicals which are called neonicotinoids, and they are just really bad because they will get into the stems, the leaves, the seeds, the pollen, and they've actually found, I saw an article 2 days ago, that in Minnesota, they found neonicotinoids in the deer because basically the deer ate whatever they ate, which ate whatever it ate, and and whoever was trying to, and I think, I'm not sure if they're to kill pests or fungus or whatever, but that's what happened. Roundup, there's been lawsuits about Roundup possibly causing cancer in humans, and it certainly has caused all kinds of damage to wildlife. Gas-powered equipment, I'll let you read what it says there. It's pretty amazing. Using a gas-powered lawnmower for 1 hour is equivalent to driving a car 200 miles, according to the EPA. So there are old-fashioned, there's push mowers, hand tools, rakes, etc. And there are electric models and there are battery-operated models, which are much more climate-friendly. Okay, and speaking of lawns, I think we covered lawns earlier. One thing I would say is that there's a new movement for freedom lawns, which means that you put clover and violets and dandelions and sedges into the lawn so that the pollinators have something that benefits them. And they are working on lower growing grasses that don't need to be mowed as often. In England, they have tapestry lawns where they weave in all sorts of plants. If you're thinking of reducing the size of your lawn, you could use ground covers instead. You could just bit by bit maybe plant some other things around the edges. That's an idea. Lawn chemicals, I believe this is self-explanatory, this slide, but the problem with lawns, as I said earlier, is that in order to keep them looking the way we think they should look, you really do have to put an awful lot of fertilizer and herbicides to kill the broadleaf weeds, and it's sort of a vicious cycle. And then the lawn becomes dependent, and you have to use more. And the EPA has found that homeowners use many, many more chemicals on their lawns than farmers do on their crops. Okay. One of the final topics I want to just mention is invasive. So what I've found, you like that picture of kudzu? It looks kind of like a monster. What I found when I've been talking with people about this is that this is the most maybe misunderstood subject, which is interesting. So I think I always used to think invasive meant like if in your garden there's something that you planted and it's just taking over the rest of your garden, it's invading your garden, it's driving you crazy, that's an invasive. But that's actually not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that may be fine in your garden. For example, I had 2 very beautiful Nandina shrubs in these huge pots, and they were glorious, and they got berries, and the more I researched this book, I'm like, I can't. So finally I'm like, okay, I gotta do this, and I got rid of them, and then I thought, well, I'll give them to somebody. I was like, no, you won't give them to somebody because nobody should have them, you know. So they had to just go away to wherever Nandinas go to die. And the reason, so Nandina is invasive. There's a whole list in the book of invasives, which will, I think, shock you. I mean, there's over 70 plants. The North Carolina Invasive Plants Association has a list. What it means is that the plant may be fine in your garden or your neighbor's garden, but either through dispersal through the wind, through the seeds, or birds that eat the berry and poop it, 20 miles away. When these plants, one way or another, get themselves deposited in a wilderness area, an untouched area, unspoiled area where the animals and the birds and the insects have a habitat. These still unspoiled areas that Doug Tallamy was talking about. There aren't very many of them, but we have to preserve them. And what happens is the invasive gets in there, and it outcompetes all the natives because it doesn't have any natural enemies, and it unfortunately it benefits from climate change. So invasives, what they'll do is they will choke out all the other native plants, making a very poor ecosystem. And so this is, again, bad for our friends who are the butterflies and the bees and the birds and all the other insects. So we would think that certainly knowing what the invasives are, the garden centers would not sell them. However, they do. So I'm going to just read you quickly a list that may make you sad, but it's true. Butterfly bush, popcorn tree, English ivy, privet, also known as ligustrum, princess tree, tree of heaven, mimosa, miscanthus grass, nandina, Bradford pear, and there are 70 others that are listed. So I was talking the other night at somewhere, and this man just kept saying, my butterfly bush, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm just a messenger. I actually did not create this problem, but I feel sort of obligated to report on it because I found out about it. And so, if you're on a church committee or you have any influence over who plants what in some public planting or whatever, just don't let them plant invasives. And then we're going to finish just with a few nice pictures of some natives that do well. Two-wing silverbell blooms in the spring. Southern sugar maple is beautiful in the fall. Sweet bay magnolia, these are all natives, can take sun or even part shade, and it can stand some flooding. And tulip poplar has these pretty little blooms in spring and gold foliage in the fall. And basically there's no end to all the different natives that you can use in your garden. And there's no reason the garden couldn't be just as beautiful planted with natives as it could be planted with non-natives. So just to recap, we can make a difference by making our gardens more resilient, helping our fellow creatures, and stopping the harmful practices. All these things actually work together, so it's sort of not a choice of one or the other. They all work together. And we can build healthy ecosystems and be part of the solution. And we can make a difference. And thank you all so much for listening, for your attention, and for inviting me.
We would love to have questions, and they can be relating to your own garden or whatever problems you're having with your garden. Not that Barbara might not be able to answer it specifically, but she can give you some general directions to go in. So anything that's on your mind, I'll just start with, wow, this is so amazing. I've learned so much just listening to you. And the book it contains it all. I mean, just the charts alone. You can find charts for color in the fall, charts for, native species, color in the spring, flood resistant, drought resistant plants. This is why it's better to use a book by a real expert than just go online and try to find everything for yourself. It's all put together here for you. And I think one question would be great, Barbara, since native plants are so important, is if you could address how to find them, where to get them, generally speaking.
That's actually one of the toughest questions, I think. And I'm just hoping that the gardening industry will start moving more. I think they are. I think there's Southern Living Plants, I believe. I don't want to say the wrong name, but there are some prominent companies, especially in the South, and this book is written for gardeners in the South, who are trying to use, what they do is they create things called nativars, and what that means, so a cultivar is, let me start from the beginning. A plant that is just growing in nature and that just came there naturally is called a species plant. And then sometimes over hundreds of years, gardeners have taken that plant and they've made a cultivar of it. So they've made it a different color, or they've made it bigger, or they've made it bloom for a longer period of time. And those are called cultivars. And so that's been happening since forever. I think probably Thomas Jefferson was probably making cultivars, just fooling around with plants to make them do what you want them to do. And a nativar is like that, but what you start with is a native plant. So some of the gardening companies now are trying to do more and more nativars. So you're not getting exactly the native plant, but I think they're fine. I think they're good because you're getting very close to what the native plant is, and hopefully they'll have the same benefit for the pollinators and insects. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, we're fortunate in Chapel Hill because the North Carolina Botanical Garden grows
Amazing program.
hundreds and hundreds.
They grow them too. Okay.
Oh no, they're everything they sell, they have grown.
Oh, I didn't know they sold plants. I mean, I knew they
Yeah,
had
they
wonderful
sell
native.
plants.
Yeah.
They
that's
have
great.
a small outdoor garden shop that operates year round and has plants by season.
Wow.
And then, in fact, it was just this last Friday and Saturday, every third weekend in September annually, they have their native plant sale. And that's when everything you could possibly grow here is on sale. Again, just like what you said, you want to plant it in the fall.
Yes, you want to plant it. That is so wonderful. I wish every town and city in the South would do that. That'd be so great.
Well, all of the North Carolina botanical gardens throughout the state and arboretums
Right.
propagate native plants.
Right. We have an arboretum in Wellington. It does host a plant
Did
sale.
you say it was every third sales?
The annual sale is every third weekend in September for fall planting. But throughout the year, you can get plants that you can plant during that particular season. It's just in September, everything possible is there.
And it's really popular. I've tried to go sometimes and they sell out.
They
It's
have-
flocked.
Well, and there is a huge demand for native plants. I mean, we have a very small plant sale in Wilmington, and you just can't even find anywhere to park because. So it's sort of like the industry has not quite caught up yet. I just think there's a trend, and I really do. And But there are more and more now, online, there are companies
Online
that sell
stuff.
native plants, and I have bought some from them, and they've been in great condition and worked well, so, yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Great.
Can we have just 5 minutes?
Yeah, no worries.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Sorry.
Yes.
I'm just curious, granted this book goes towards the south, but the basic principles would be applicable in the west coast, north, and Texas,
Yes.
New Mexico, is that?
They would, and the way it is, directed at the south is all the, tables and charts that are in the back, I think there's 23 of them, are specifically for the southeastern part of the United States, because they're completely different, growing conditions and things
Right.
in other parts. And there are other things throughout the book that refer to southern, to the south. But yeah, you're right, the same. And other parts, I don't wanna get carried away, but other parts of the country have other, challenges, more fires than we do. And we have, for example, in the south, we have fewer cooling nights. Certain plants need a certain number of cooling nights during the winter and before they get ready to bloom. And so they're waiting in the spring, like we're waiting for and they don't get the right number of cooling nights because winters are changing. So that's something that's special to the south. So there's just different things. But
And the
absolutely,
only other
it's-
thing I wanted to say was Duke Gardens has a native
They
plant.
have a
sale.
beautiful, they
That's-
have a sale.
Yeah.
And they have a beautiful.
And they're on sale all year round.
Oh, that's
Oh,
good.
There's also now a new native plant shop in Durham.
Oh,
It's called
lucky.
Deep Roots.
Deep roots.
I haven't been there yet, but a friend has been there.
Great, great, you all are lucky.
Writing this down.
Deep Roots.
Barbara, we have a shade, I mean, we don't have any part of our yard that gets 60% or 40 to 60% of the time.
Sun.
Sunlight.
Yeah, but there's lots and lots of shade plants. The way I have it organized, well, in the first book I had it grouped by shade, but in this book I have it, so what you have to do is you have to look through and it'll tell whether it's shade, whether the plant would like to be in the full sun, part shade, or shade. And so you can sort of cross-reference and you can go through and find the ones that will do part shade or shade and then see if that's, and it doesn't just have to be ferns, there's all sorts of, I have a lot of shade in my garden actually.
I was getting ready to say, as I remember it, it was very shady.
Yeah, it's a lot of shade, but you
And
would not
beautiful,
believe all
by the
the
way, if
things.
you haven't seen it. It's just gorgeous.
There's a lot of things, I try everything. As I said, sometimes I have these poor little plants, and like, oh, you can do it. But, yeah, so there's lots of plants for shade, and,
Well, I can't wait to see if Helleborus is considered an invasive species.
it's not invasive, it's not native, and it's not invasive, that's the good news. Yeah, so, yeah, that's a Lenten rose, a hellebore,
Yes, we have
and,
a ton.
yeah, and I have a lot of those in
And
my
it's
garden.
just grown itself. We have a terrible deer problem.
Yeah, do they eat the hellebore? I
No,
don't like them.
that's about the only thing that they
They
won't
don't
eat.
eat,
So
no.
we need to find some things that we can
Yes,
plant that they
Well,
won't eat. We've been sort of intimidated because they ate everything that was at the house when we bought it 20 years ago. Hydrangeas, everything that was gone.
and well, they say they will eat just about anything.
I wish they would eat English ivy.
Yeah, there you go.
Or bamboo grass.
When we left tonight.
Those
we
are
got
the
here-
two
Mhm.
that I've
Oh, yeah.
struggled, yeah.
Nope, it won't
Well, the
be
goats
either.
eat English ivy because I was reading that you can rent some goats.
Goats, you
Goats
can.
will eat both of them. They'll eat English
And they'll eat
ivy
the
and
will.
I heard that they will, but it's their last
it's
choice.
their last choice, yeah. It's not their first choice.
So
So
it's
you-
gonna be dangerous, but. Wow.
Yeah, so,
Hire a bunch of goats. There is a woman, a goat lady.
Yeah.
Like,
who-
just to follow up on that point, is that, there are many plants, especially, I don't know if it's as much here, but where we are in Wilmington and places like Savannah and Charleston, where azaleas and camellias are sort of the queens of the garden. And the good news is there's not a problem. They are well suited, They don't have a whole lot of needs in terms of having to be sprayed or fertilized, and they do fine, and they're not native, they're from China, but,
I'm afraid we promised
We
that
ran out
we'd
of
stop
time.
20 minutes ago.
I'm sorry.
But, I think,
Sorry.
I'm sorry,